So, hello everyone, and welcome to Running a Mega Game Network. This is the first event of MegaCon Saturday. Thank you for joining us. My name is Becky Campbell-Ladley. You might know me as BeckyBecky. I have designed Everybody Dies, the Game of Thrones mega game, and Trope High, the American high school fantasy mega game, and I blog over at BeckyBecky Blogs. And I am joined today by three fantastic people who all are involved in the running of a mega gaming group. And they're going to be sharing some of their experiences in running that group. So I'll start off by introducing them. So we're joined today by Dave. Hi, Dave. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Becky. And my name's Dave Boundy. I'm from Megagame Makers, which has been running Megagames for some while. I've been playing. I'm a newcomer, so I've been playing since 1991, and I've played 105 mega games with Megagame Makers and a number of other mega games in 3 different countries, apart from the UK. I've designed Washington Conference, which is one of 2 rather out there games for diplomats, and I've been the joint designer of Interesting Times about Chinese Civil War, the Chinese ongoing problems, and The Price of Victory, which is a very operational game. I've been involved in organising. I have some difficulty with the word running, actually, in the same way I have difficulty with the word control. When I'm doing the control job in a mega game, the last thing I feel is in control. And when I'm running Mega Game Makers, the last thing I feel is that I'm running anything. And so I've been involved in organising Mega Game Makers for some while. I've implemented the website and the booking and support systems, and I've just been sort of there doing the jobs.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dave. And it would be, I'm sure most people have heard of Mega Game Makers and be interested to see a bit behind the scenes about how that's all run. So yeah. Fantastic. Next, I'd like to introduce John. How are you, John?
Hello, I'm good. My name is John. I run Southwest Mega Games, which runs Mega Games in the UK, essentially just anywhere west of London. I've designed several of my own games, most famously Den of Wolves, but also other games called A World Divided, Planetfall, Sugar and Sedition, and a sort of mini mega game type thing called Heist. And also I've done a couple of major game reformats, like Watch the Skies, West Second Sight, and Urban Nightmare Wisconsin, which are obviously Jim Wallman's designs, but I redid them so that I could make them into something that I was really interested in creating. And yeah, I run Southwest Mega Games, which is a one-man operation. It's pretty rare in that it is a business, so I do make money from it. I don't think there's anyone else doing that. Please feel free to correct me. I know that there are a few people like Jim Wallman, obviously, who do mega game-like stuff as a business, but my understanding is most of what they bring in is through private contracts with businesses and other organizations, rather than doing what other people do, running them as a hobby for recreational purposes as a business. So that's what makes me interesting, I hope.
Yeah, that was the reason why I wanted you on this panel very much, because it's a very different approach to Mega Game Makers. So be interesting to hear what some of your answers to some of my questions are. And then our final guest is Nellie. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. I am calling in from Australia, where it is 10 p.m. rather than 11 a.m.
Thank you for staying up late for us.
It's okay. Dave has been playing mega games for longer than I have been alive. So I run Melbourne Mega Games down in Melbourne, Australia. Outside of that, I am a PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne, and my research is linked to games. So I look into sort of museums and education and entertainment. And so one of the studies that I'm doing will be to put a mega game essentially into a museum and see how that kind of works. So I have a an interesting perspective there, in that I have a professional interest and an academic interest in games and gameplay, and that, as well as yes, Patrick, I did see your panel happen and then go, oh, I should have been on that one. But I'm here instead to talk about Melbourne Megagames and how we work. So yeah.
Brilliant. So thanks everyone for joining us. As Chris has said in the chat already, if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat, but I've got some pre-prepared ones as well. So we'll just get started with those. So we have talked about it a little bit already, but if you could just give us an overview of each of your groups. So who runs it, how it's organized, who sort of what the fundamentals are of how the group operates, that would be great. Nellie, do you want to start?
Yeah, so we started in 2019, and it's just me and my professional partner, Tristan. And so we both played a mega game, I think, in 2018 by an Australian designer. And that was run by the group that exists in Geelong, which is just a town outside of Melbourne. And they run about one game a year, and we went, we want to play more games than that. So we got together and borrowed from them Jim Wallman's Watch the Skies, because they had that pre-prepared, and we sold tickets for $5, which is £2, and sold it out, and it was fantastic. And then pulled in another Australian game and have kind of built up from there to now. We've just run, at the end of last year, we ran an original game from a Melbourne designer. But it is still fundamentally the two of us. We've started pulling more people in to help us with the logistics, and as we get more people who are designing their own games and bringing that to it, it's kind of expanding. I'd say we have maybe a community of 200 players who come in and out for the games that we run. It's a bit hard to say, kind of coming out of the pandemic. We've only been around for a few years. Yeah, I might leave it at that, and we can dip in and out of other elements.
Great. And Dave, you mentioned that the tasks you do for Megagame Makers, but it's quite a big organization, isn't it, compared to Nellie's? So how does that work?
No, it's about half the size of Nellie's, because there aren't many people actually running it. Megagame Makers is just a group of friends. It's a group of friends that enjoy designing mega games. So anybody can be a mega game maker if they've run a mega game in the last 5 years for Megagame Makers, and or are planning to run a game with us. So Megagame Makers is really just a name that applies to this group of friends who use the same support structure. So the Megagame Makers, in a real sense, is the support structure. But I think you have to understand a little bit of the history to understand Megagame Makers. Megagame Makers were there about 10 years after the first game that was called a mega game. And the four of them, the original Megagame Makers, decided that there were groups around that were running mega games that really were not things you would want, that they wanted to be associated with. And they wanted some way of saying, look, we're running a game and you can think of it as a quality game. They also wanted a way of sharing out the admin. So they decided to call themselves as a group Megagame Makers. They had a marketing professional as one of them. So they had the logo, and to everybody, they might have looked like a professional group. But they really, really weren't. And they had a very different culture, born of the age, I think, which is very much a hobby culture. And I think even Jim has that still. He runs mega games for profit, but he also runs mega games for fun and doesn't expect to make a profit out of it. And so the person running it was not a chair, was not a president, was an admin officer. And they were the people that did the admin. They kept the records, they sent out the stuff, they kept everybody involved. and we've had that continuing for a number of years. And I was the admin officer for some considerable while. We now do not have an admin officer. We do not have anybody running Megagame Makers except the group of people who get together once a year and maybe twice a year, and who get together on email and make decisions that are necessary. And that's been allowed because we now have a very supportive website. The public face of that takes bookings, takes payments. We use PayPal, but that's direct so that we keep the costs down. And the whole philosophy of Megagame Makers has been to provide the structure that allows people to get the most fun out of it, both designers and people that come. So we've always had a philosophy of trying to keep costs down in order to keep barriers down. And so the website really is now the public face that takes the bookings, but behind the scenes, we've got a lot of functionality to help the designers. And that's really at the center of what we do now. So if anybody's interested, I can, and the reason I asked to be able to share the screen, I can show the functionality that we have. If anybody's interested, and ask for that in the chat.
That sounds cool. Yeah, if people are interested to see that, please let us know in the chat. But in the meantime, I'm just going to go on to John to talk a little bit about how Southwest is set up. You already mentioned it's just you, so do you want to talk about how that came about and all that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so yeah, it's the simplest one to explain. I do everything. I do all the marketing, I do all the admin, I do all the production and organization, I do all the designing, I run all the games with a handful of exceptions. And we might get into that later. But yeah, it's all me. So obviously there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that I do run it as a business, and it is not a business with like a huge revenue or something. So I can't necessarily employ people to do it for me. And you know, if I am making money off it, it's the important thing about doing it as a business is not that it makes money, it's that it gives me a lot more time to do it. So obviously, if I have that time, I may as well use it to do, you know, all the marketing and the admin and the design and the production and all the other things that mean, you know, designing and organizing a mega game takes time to do. I think there's also a sort of a secondary reason, and you know, this is not anything that I had in mind when I started setting it up or anything, but it is something that I've sort of thought about when it comes to how I look at other bigger game groups, which are obviously very sort of, you know, large numbers of people all sort of sharing an organization like Megagame Makers and like other groups, which is that when you're doing everything yourself, you do have a lot of control over everything, which I appreciate. I think I'm naturally quite an anxious person, and something that is a serious cause of that anxiety can be uncertainty. So when it comes to working in groups, I can sometimes get kind of stressed out because if I'm relying on other people to do things that I need to happen, then, you know, if I'm uncertain of, you know, how far through they are with it, if they've done it correctly or not, it can be kind of concerning. And I also don't want to just like bother those people by constantly asking them questions about it. If you've ever had me as a controller or a player at your game, you'll know I ask a lot of questions, and that's the tip of the iceberg. Also, you know, if someone else has an idea that they're pushing forward and I think it's a bit risky, you know, it might result in it not working and player not having a good time or whatever, or just something that I don't think is going to work, that can also be kind of stressful because, you know, I don't necessarily, you know, either it's going to go ahead and I'll be worried about that uncertainty, or I have to challenge them on it, which, you know, is stressful in its own way. And, you know, maybe it'll work, maybe they were right at the end of the day, but there's still that time period in which I have to worry about it. And, you know, I'm sure a lot of people can sympathize with the idea of anxiety and, you know, the sort of complex social structures you get. And there's definitely advantages, a lot of advantages to having a large group with a lot of people in it. But obviously there's also advantages to just having a solo operation. So that's, you know, I think those are some benefits of doing it the way I do it.
Yeah, I totally know where you're coming from, and I'm very much in the camp of I like to only have myself to worry about. So that's very familiar to me. Great, thank you. So just to move on to something, and again, I think it is something we have touched on, but I think it's really good. And I've got a lot of questions here. So if we can be really concise with this answer, it's a tough question, but it's what's the purpose of your mega game group? Just quite a quick, if you had to sum it up in like 1 or 2 points, the key purpose of your group. Dave, would you like to start?
Well, I think I touched on that, but the key purpose is basically to allow designers to get in touch with players and to play the games that the designers want to run. It's a group of designers who, in a sense, are selfish because they want to run mega games, but in another sense, that results in something that it's only successful if it results in something that players want to play. So, you know, it's a synergy, but it's there to just do whatever the designers want to do.
Cool. So it's a very designer focused model. Cool. John, how would you say, what would you say the purpose of your group is?
It's a complicated one, but as you've forced me to answer this very succinctly, I'll just say that when I started it, it was because I'd run a couple of games when the idea of Southwest Mega Games didn't exist. It was just me running 2 games. I realized I quite like doing it. I realized that it's possible to make some, not a lot, some money from running a game when you don't have to spend all the time designing it and buying the materials and stuff. You know, the second run of any game, you obviously save a lot of money on that. And at the time, I was very unhappy with where I worked, and I was looking for other opportunities to do something else for my career. And I had a little bit saved up as insurance, and I just thought, let's give it a try. And I've just been sort of trundling along like that for 5 years. And that's sort of the only way I can describe the purpose of the organization. I was looking for something else to do with my life. It is a job. I try not to describe it as a for-profit business because whilst that is explicitly what it is, and I'm not going to deny that, for-profit implies that that's the goal, whereas in actuality, I've turned it into a business so I can spend more time on it because that money allows me to pay rent and food and stuff, so I don't have to do a different job. Although I do have other jobs, but I won't get to it. So it's something I wanted to spend more time on. It's a career I like having. That's the purpose. That's my succinct answer. It probably took about 6-7 minutes. That's not very succinct at all.
Yeah, turning a passion into a job is many of our dreams. So that sounds really great. Nellie, how about you over in Melbourne?
So the simple answer is just that it was to bring mega games to Melbourne because Australia is very, I guess, sparse in how densely populated we are, and that, you know, we're very concentrated in the major cities. So if there's nothing in your city, that's it. You're out of luck. So it was to make mega games accessible in Melbourne, and then to build a community out of that, and then to grow that really is the current purpose of Melbourne Mega Games. And I would be thrilled to see other groups start up in Melbourne just for a diversity of games, but for now it's just us, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I think London is the only city in the UK that's got multiple groups that sort of are regularly running games in the same city. So
Reading does kind of.
Actually,
it's hard to say now because Reading Mega Games started gearing up just before pandemic started, relatively speaking. So they haven't obviously run that many recently, but Reading does sort of have 2 in the same sense.
Yeah, that's very true, actually. And it's also very close to London as well. So there is that bit of overlap in terms of player bases. Yeah. We've got a very different model in the UK in that our cities are a lot closer together than in Australia or in somewhere like the US.
Yeah. Actually, can I come back on what I said? I specifically answered the question about what is the Megagame Makers group, but there is a difference, I think, in how we regard the Megagame Makers network, which is quite extended from that group. We really do feel part of a community of designers, players, people running the game, you know, and we are very interdependent, both inside the group and with the wider community. We're very dependent for instance, on everybody for control. That's, I mean, one of the key holding factors on any mega game group and network is control. And, you know, we do look to be really regarded as just an extended group of friends when we've got players coming along.
Yeah, I think that is one of the key issues, I think, when you're a group, because I used to be chair of Pennine Megagames, and a lot of the questions was always, okay, well, in order to run games, we need the designers. In order to run games, we also need players to come along to those games. And also, in order to run the games, we also need control to control at those games. And it's such an important, tightly woven ecosystem. The games, if any of these things didn't exist, the games couldn't exist. And I'd like to now go on and talk about how each of you handle each of these types of important aspects to your games. So let's start with talking about designers. So how do you work with designers, and how do you encourage new designers? Nellie, would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, so we've got a bit of an interesting model in that we kind of run 3 types of games. So we run games, and I guess like Den of Wolves would be a good example, where you buy the game, you get all of the components. You might have to manufacture some of the bits yourselves, particularly for us. We live in Australia, so we can't necessarily be shipped physical components. And so we've done a few of those. And then there are the games where we did a game at the start of 2021 that we kind of took on as a bit of a project, in that we paid a small licensing fee and got a game that wasn't finished, basically. So a lot of the content hadn't actually been filled out. It had run, but it run kind of out of the designer's like inspiration on the day, as their, you know, control team had sort of made it up on the fly for a lot of it. And whilst that was awesome, it wasn't replicable. And the other thing that I haven't mentioned is that I'm an artist, I'm a visual designer. And so we sort of reskinned that whole game, filled out a lot of the content, and we've taken on and intend to take on kind of projects like that, where we take games that maybe need a little bit of love, and we put in the sort of behind the scenes work to bring them up to a higher standard. And then the new games we have, because we're quite a new group, we're starting to see people emerge who are have got games that they want run. So we had one at the end of 2021, a game called The Ark, that came from scratch from one of our community members. And it's interesting because, in a similar vein to John, I do a lot of the work just myself. And so because I have that design skill set, Leon, who is in the chat, whose game it is, did all the like game design, the mechanics, produced all the content, and then I did all of the design work for it, and we put it on. And I'm not sure how sustainable that is going to be going forward, particularly because I'm doing a PhD. But I guess we want to give designers as much support as we can, and to bring their games from an idea all the way through. I think we're going to run some workshops this year, try and sort of expand in that direction. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, that sounds very, very, very supportive, but also, yeah, as you say, quite intensive. Dave, do you want to talk a bit about how Megagame Makers works with new designers? I know that, I mean, my first game was a Megagame Makers game, so I know that you do a lot to develop new designers.
Well, I mean, Megagame Makers is the designers, so, you know, we have gone out of our way to try to encourage new designers, with limited success, if I'm honest. I mean, it's quite straightforward when you get somebody that you can talk to, such as yourself, Becky, and say, well, look, this is interesting. You're obviously interested. Why don't you think about, and you really, I think, probably took the initiative anyway. But to actually go out of your way to get in new designs that you don't know about and don't generally sort of become aware of as potential is quite difficult. We had an idea that we would sort of say to everybody, if you have an idea and it is a feasible idea, then we will support you. If you want to work with one of the Megagame Makers, then we are happy to do that. And we will run the game as part of the Megagame Makers program. That had one person that responded. I mean, there are lots of people out there who have an idea for a Megagame. There are fewer people that have a good idea for a Megagame, and there are even fewer that are prepared to do the work involved in designing a Megagame. As we really wanted to run something that is quality, we were, you know, whether we came across as too quality driven and put people off, I don't know. But we had Ed Silverstone worked with us on that and put on his Grace of God game, and he's taken that on now to other places. But it would be nice to get some idea of how to expand the group, because we are going to see the group contract because designers face burnout, and they face all sorts of different things in their lives. So unless you work at it, I think you're going to see the group contract. And we do try to encourage people who might be involved in being a designer. There have been a few actually who've joined in and fallen by the wayside, and we've had some horrendous designs that we really don't want to inflict on players. So it is a delicate balancing act.
Well, speaking about contracting, John, you are a one-man designer band. So your challenges when it comes to design are probably quite different to Dave and Nellie's. So do you want to talk a little bit about how you handle being the only designer in your group?
Well, I mean, the simple answer to that is that my design process is probably almost the same as any other person designing a mega game on their own, which I'm sure there are plenty of people, you know, who in large groups are just the person who's doing all the work on their mega game, right? I don't think that's uncommon at all. But I do think I have an interesting answer on how I work with other designers, because it is something that does factor in. As I mentioned before, whilst I do almost all of the work, there are occasional exceptions. So for example, I do have guest designers come in to run their games for me. So Alex Beck, Jim Wallman, Zane Gunton, they're all people who have come out west to run their games. They run their game and they benefit from me doing a lot of the admin and organizational work, and you know, from having access to my player base. And I benefit from, you know, it's an interesting new game that a lot of people haven't played before if they haven't been able to travel all the way to where they normally run their games. So you know, that factors in. But as also, I sometimes provide detailed advice to new designers. I had someone recently, they had a grant, a government grant to make a game for education purposes. And he actually contracted me to help him out. So I gave him some detailed advice. You know, he sent over his game spec. I went through it point by point. We've had several like multi-hour video calls where like I've just really gotten into like the concepts and the ideas behind like what his mechanics do, what makes them engaging. You know, you're sort of really getting into it. And of course, on a much smaller level, you know, I get a lot of emails with questions from designers, which I'm always happy to help with. You know, obviously I sell the Den of Wolves pack. So people are often emailing me asking rules questions or asking things like, you know, I want to make sure the game goes well, it happens like this and stuff, and how do I make sure that happens and you know, things don't go wrong. So, you know, I help them out with that. And, you know, sometimes people want to add things or change things, and they'll be like, do you think this is a good idea? How do you think this will actually play out? So I help them with that. Yeah, and sometimes I'll even get questions, sometimes from close friends and whatnot. They'll be thinking of designing a game, not even necessarily a mega game, but they'll see a mechanic in like Den of Wolves or another mega game, and they'll say, hey, I'm thinking of adapting this for mine. what are the strengths and weaknesses? How does it actually work? What are all the bits and pieces behind the scenes? So there's plenty of stuff that I do interacting with designers and new designers, even if, by and large, it's really just me doing all the design work.
Oh, great. Yeah. Jim's chimed in to say that you give detailed advice to old designers as well. So
that's Jim's very polite way of saying that I sent him a 20-question list whenever he sends me a game briefing. And Jim's like, well, I guess I could change a couple of those.
Cool. I can also see we've had a question from Jim about how Pennine works, and I will just comment on that briefly because it is different, again, a different setup to what sounds like all of these. So Pennine has a committee of 3 people. It previously had a committee of 5 people. Now it's a committee of 3 people. I no longer live in the Pennines, so I'm not actually involved in Pennines anymore. But it had a chair, a treasurer, and a secretary, more like a sort of traditional sort of organization, hobby organization structure that you might expect. And they were elected on an annual basis, or sort of annual basis, sort of sometimes slip by the wayside to do the elections. And then that committee, along with a group called Pennine Planning, they led the Pennine Planning group to come up with a calendar for the annual games. So it's sort of similar to the Megagame Makers structure, in that there were a group of people who are passionate about Megagames who want to be involved in doing it, but I think it had a bit more of the sort of formality in the structure of it. But I'm not going to talk about it too much because I'm not involved with Pennine anymore, and I really want to focus on our guests. But that's just to answer Jim's question.
I will chime in and say that Melbourne Megagames are looking to transition. We're looking to formalize and become a non-for-profit, which would see us adopt a similar structure. And one of the things that we keep snagging on is a similar anxiety to John's, in that I don't want to let go of the control that we have, that Tristan and I have particularly, because we have such strong visions and ideas and so much momentum driving us to do this, that I think opening it up is very anxiety inducing. But at the same time, incorporating and adopting a non-for-profit status gives us access to a bunch of grants and cheaper venue hire and all of that. So it's interesting that that does exist and seems to work. I just thought I'd add that.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to have a chat with you about all the things that we experienced doing Pennine, and I'm sure other people who've been involved in Pennine would be happy to do that.
I'm full of admiration for both John and Nellie for doing this lot without being involved in a wide team. I can't imagine that. We get so much help. I've given a lot of help to people. If somebody said, I haven't got time to do a game, then I had to do a map. Then I've done a map for somebody a couple of years back. And if somebody has got problems with something, then they will just bounce it off anybody appropriate in the team. It's very difficult to run a game without that for me. And I would say, Nellie, that you sound as if you could run a team quite well, and it doesn't actually stop, a team doesn't stop you having a strong vision and taking it in a particular direction. You just need to have the right team with you, and having the right group of friends is probably a way to go.
Yeah, I think what we've decided is to move slowly rather than just sort of jumping all the way into it. And so bringing people in game by game. So, Leon sort of spearheaded the arc, and then the games that we've got planned out for 2022, we've got 1 or 2 people coming in to help us for each of those. And hopefully we will build a team out of that. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. That's very kind of you to say.
So let's move on to talk about one of the other categories of important parts of games, and that's players. So how do you attract new players? So both Nellie and John, you've been in areas where there haven't necessarily been, Dave as well, back when Megagame Makers first started, to be fair, but that's a while back now. But Nellie and John, you grew when Megagames were existing, but not necessarily in your areas. So you had to attract new players in your areas who might not have heard about Megagames, or might have heard about them and they were in your area. So can you talk a bit about that? Let's start with John.
I think having enough players at my games has been a pretty constant challenge. I'd say 90% of my games don't fill up by the time they run. For those of you who aren't super familiar with UK geography, I run games west of London. So that includes places like Reading and Bristol, which have, I think Bristol has 500,000 people. I could be entirely wrong. I may be remembering that. So it's, it's quite big, but it's not huge. And I run games in other places as well, like Cheltenham, Swindon, Oxford, which are even smaller. It's just, I wanted to run games. I wanted to have as wide a player base as possible. And those are the places I can travel to reasonably without, it being too much work or money for me to get there. So getting enough people has always been a real struggle. I've always, marketing, like I said, I do all my own marketing, but marketing is a complicated, difficult, and risky business. Marketing, if you really want to invest in it, then it does cost a lot of money, and there's very little chance that the money's going to pay off. And like I said, it's a low revenue organization, Southwest Megagames, so I don't have a lot of money to throw around. So I tend to keep things simple. I do a lot of asking people to spread the word around. I've always been a big advocate of word of mouth marketing. Not only because to a certain degree it is effective, but also because I think it's effective in the best way. You tend to get people who do know what to expect when they get there, like not people who completely misunderstand the ads you're putting out, or and you tend to get good quality people, because essentially every player that comes in from word of mouth marketing is being vouched for by the person that brought them. In a sense, they're saying, this is a person who gets it, this is a person who's into this kind of gaming. So yeah, I do a lot of asking people to share the word around, word of mouth. In terms of other stuff, social media marketing, very low cost. I do a lot of finding local groups that are into things like board games and tabletop RPGs, obviously the classic connected hobbies. I'll check that with whoever runs the group. Is it okay if I just post once or twice about my game? Majority of the time they actually say yes. You're nice and you're polite. It's obviously relevant to the interests of the people in the group. So I throw it up there. Mixed results, but it does get results. It tends to be that if you can find that one person who's like, I would love to do this, and then they bring 5 to 20 people with them, as long as you can find that one person, then it tends to work. Generally speaking, I just generally when I'm putting up posts about the games, I'm just trying to be simple, honest, and respect the audience. It's the kind of ads that I personally would like to see and would respond to. It's not exploitative, it's not clickbait or whatever. It's just, here's the thing, here's where it is. It's about the your classic 2-line summary of what Megagames are. It's half LARP, half board game, whatever. And link to the thing, and then if they are interested by that, they'll click on the link, and all the information about the game is there without trying to overwhelm them. I could maybe reach more people by getting deep into really complex marketing stuff, but I like the simplicity and consistency of my strategy. I also, not to take up all the time, I do think one of the best advertisements for a game is just a good game. Obviously, that's not a short-term strategy, that's a long-term strategy. But I try really, really hard to make sure that people at my games, everyone has a good time, or at least as close to everyone has a good time as possible. And I think if you build up an audience of people who just like the product, and you combine that with this sort of word of mouth strategy, you do get results. It's definitely easier for me to get enough players now. I say now, it's definitely easier for me to get players up until March 2020 than it was when I started. Whilst I'm still doing that 90% of my games don't fill up thing, it's a lot easier to get to almost full now than it used to be. I've got a lot of people who players and friends, they like my games, they trust me, they sign up, they try and bring their friends in because they think that their friends are probably the kind of people who enjoy it. That's how it works for me. I'm done.
I work in marketing, and I love that you just called marketing risky. I've never thought that was in a risky job.
I mean, maybe not to be a marketer, but to pay for marketing is
I'm taking it that marketing itself, being a marketer, is as dangerous as lion taming. Cool. Yeah, thank you. Nellie, so you started obviously in a country where Megagames were originated in sort of like the UK and the US and things, and there was a lot less that you would practically bring it to a whole new country. So do you want to talk about that, and definitely a whole new city?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Shut Up and Sit Down video has done a lot of heavy lifting for us, as has the Watch the Skies, the name. Everyone, if they know a mega game, that's the game they know. It was the first one we ran. And the other trick that we pulled is that Tristan and I started this organization fresh out of uni. And so we had a university board games group that clocks up a membership between 500 and 1,000 students each year. And they meet twice a week for like 6-hour stints to play board games on campus. And so we kind of advertised to them, ran the first game on campus, and then had the same ripple effect of word of mouth, where that's been our strategy from then on, is to sort of, the first game, we bullied all of our friends. The second game, they all bullied their friends. And by the 5th game, we have people bringing their parents and like so on and so forth. And so it's kind of easy to say this now. It doesn't feel like it was a lot of effort to ever get players. We've sold out all of the games that we've done, and I'm sure that, touch wood, we're going to hit a point where that stops happening as we get more ambitious and we run more frequent games. But yeah, I guess because we are the only group in Melbourne who run regular games, and I say regular, we did 2 games last year that we ran twice. So kind of 40 player games that we did 2 separate versions of so that we could get 80 players through. I'm not sure how far past that we're going to get. I don't think we're going to run some sort of 70 to 100 person games this year. I don't think we'll get 2 runs of those, but we might more spread out. But yeah, we do some social media advertising, but it's very, oh, did you remember to post on Instagram? No. Have we got photos from the last game? Yeah, better put one up. Kind of, or I'll post the artwork that I've done, particularly when I finish it and I'm really proud of it. Then it goes on Instagram. But I don't have a good sense of like who follows us on what. But yeah.
Yeah, I've seen the artwork that you've done, and it does look fantastic. That definitely gets me liking all your posts on Instagram. So Dave, this is obviously an issue that Megagame Makers has been dealing with for a very long time, how to keep getting new players in.
I hate to correct you, Becky, but actually when Megagame Makers started, it wasn't a problem at all. If you look at the numbers that we had soon after it started were about 700 or 800 plays a year. And that was one of the years then was the second highest that we've ever had, the highest being, I think, 2015. The numbers dropped off because people cycled through life, really, and doing other things. And by the time that the Shut Up and Sit Down people came, we were just starting to come back up from really quite a low period where it had been very difficult indeed to get player numbers. It was still difficult for some topics. Curiously, the exact reverse to what we've got now. If you had an operational military topic, which most of us were not as interested in as some other things, then it was quite easy to get numbers. If you had a science fiction topic, it was difficult. So the original Watch the Skies had 38 people who attended, including all the control. So an entire team, Brazil, had to be dropped, and you will see people dashing around looking like headless chickens because they were grossly understaffed in their team. But it was coming back up. As soon as the Shut Up and Sit Down video was released, I think it took about a week for every game that we had on the stocks to be fully booked. And then we got together and had to really try and think, you know, we're swamped with this lot. I was answering, I don't know, 20, 30 emails a day, probably more at one stage, from people wanting help, from people wanting to know more, from people wanting to book and unable to. So we had difficulty at that time. That has obviously stopped. We don't have difficulty now in the same way. I think we're more able to judge the amount of support there is and to adjust the games to that support, which is something we learned from that period. You know, you can't run a game for 100 people if you haven't got 100 people coming. So you adjust it to 40, which is what we did. You can't run a game once every month, which is what was done by Jim and others before I was involved. But you can run a game for 4 times a year because you have the support. So the important thing is, you know, you'll know from being a marketer, the important thing is to understand your player base and to adjust to it. In terms of attracting new players, we just use word of mouth mainly, I think. And I'd agree that that is definitely the best way. People know about us and then look at the website. So the website for overall Megagames, it's word of mouth and possibly exclusively. For our individual games, it's probably by going to the website and Facebook. Discord, not so much. But certainly Facebook is a real attraction. We have a newsletter we send out to people who register for a newsletter. We have been very careful about privacy because we think it's important. So that is separated. We do not use our database for publicity. We use it for booking and operations only. On the website, you can join a newsletter. If you join that newsletter, we really don't have much to do with it other than generating the newsletter on MailChimp and clicking a button which says send out. And we do that whenever we've got a new set of games to come along. But I think it's very important that we conform to the spirit and the law of anything to do with privacy.
Yeah, that is definitely a big topic in marketing at the moment. So thanks for bringing that up, Dave. So we are getting a little bit short on time, but I am just going to ask a couple more questions. So the next one that I'd like to ask is about how you encourage diversity and inclusion within your networks. One of the big challenges with word of mouth marketing is that you likely end up with players very similar to your existing player base because people tend to have friends and networks that are similar to them. So how have you tried to encourage diversity and inclusion within your network? And Nellie, would you like to start with that?
Yeah, so this one is something that I've been thinking about since we started our group. I don't know that I can say that we actually do anything active, more so than that I do my best to make sure that there is visible diversity as much as we can sort of manufacture. That isn't the right word, but I guess one of the big things that I struggle with is that often, although we find it quite easy to sell out our games, putting together a control team tends to be a bit tight, and we run into problems where we'll often ask a whole group of people to step up to control, and we end up having to make choices between someone who is really keen and passionate to take on that role and someone who then fits a diversity quota. And I always struggle in that situation to figure out how to balance that. But we've definitely found over the years that diversity seems to be increasing. And I've found the opposite with word of mouth, is that people who are hesitant to come to games are much more comfortable coming if they've got a friend. And so we actually seem to be diversifying the bigger we get. But I think visibility is really important. It kind of helps that like I started the organization, and so I'm there at every game as a female face in the room, and a lot of my female friends have come in because of that, and that then, you know, has that ripple effect. But I think about this a lot, and I don't know that I have necessarily good answers for it. Having the Women and Non-Binary International Network, which is something that was set up a few years ago, is also awesome, because it gives that space. And I talk often, when we talk about diversity, very specifically about gender diversity, because that's kind of the big one that concerns me. But I guess the other thing that we're really big on is access. So the visibility of disability gets really interesting in Megagames. But like a lot of the way that we build our game structure is to support that. And we've had a lot of success in having variously abled people come to our games and have really good times. Yeah, I'm rambling a bit, so I'm probably going to call it there. But
I also just wanted to mention you've got a code of conduct as well. And I think we adapted some of the MegaCon code of conduct on that as well. So
awesome. Yeah, that was one of the very first things I did, was to write a code of conduct, and it gets sent out with sign up information. Basically, when people sign up to the game, they are automatically agreeing to it. We also, the briefings that we do at the start and the end of the game mirror that. Yeah, I'm big on that.
Great, cool. Dave, do you want to talk about how Megagame Makers handles it?
I don't think any of us handle it very well, you know, and I think we should start from that point. It comes naturally to this group of friends to want equality. We tend to be a progressive group, a liberal group, and so that helps, because it's a natural corollary to want to include as many people from as many diverse backgrounds as possible. And we think that actually strengthens everything. There has been some improvement in the number of women. I see no improvement anywhere in racial diversity. I see, you know, and I think that is a big problem that the whole Megagame community has. We have concentrated, there has been a concentration on some things, and it might be at the expense of others. I hope it hasn't been. When people register for our database, they register as members who can book. We ask them if there's anything that we can do that would help in terms of mental or physical challenges. And we have a number of people that we would not have known about that have told us about that. And we do try to put somebody maybe who has difficulty hearing in a different situation when we do the role allocation. So we try it that way, but again, some of the venues haven't made that as easy as possible. But the one we generally use, we just have to be careful, because there is one area which is really unfriendly on the stage, and so we just have to be careful that we don't exclude anybody if we have somebody coming along that is disabled. So, you know, I don't know what the answer is. I'm not a fan, as I think you know, Becky, I'm not a fan of codes of conduct, because I don't think they deal with the problem. I think that I doubt if many people have read the code of conduct for this convention. It's too long, it's not exhaustive, and people don't read it. So it's much more important to be supportive. In that in part of that is support for new players, and which has a control person dedicated to most of our games, and they can look out for any problems. But we have an extra layer of problem in that we run a lot of historical games, and that has caused problems on several occasions, where actually on one occasion the designer went out of his way to try to include more female roles for women who only want to play female roles, and came unstuck with that because at that historical base there were unhelpful attitudes, as there often have been in history. And so if you're simulating those, you have a problem if women want to play women. If men are in those roles, well, they can, it's remarkably easy for them to deal with it, but for women it's not. And that gives us an extra layer of problem. But I don't believe we deal with it at all well, and we keep exercising our minds to try to think of better ways to deal with it. But I would direct everybody's attention to the issue of race, which I do not think is actually dealt with at all well by any of us.
I very much agree on that, and it was actually one of the panels that we wanted to run this year, but we weren't able to run because it's such an issue that we can't find people to speak about it, unfortunately. If anyone is interested or knows anyone who's interested in talking about that topic, please come forward to MegaCon. We'd love to host a topic on that. John, we are very close to the end, but would you like to add any thoughts about inclusion and diversity?
Only very briefly, conveniently. So I'll avoid repeating a lot of the stuff Nellie and Dave have already said. When you're posting photos and sharing other stuff, including visibility for for diverse people is good. Something I do. In terms of inclusion and accessibility, I wanted to mention briefly. I've had a number of different people say, someone's in a wheelchair, and aliens are on the stage with there's a staircase. I brief alien control in advance. Like, if this player happens to need to talk to aliens, can you bring them down the staircase so that they're ready to do that at a moment's notice? I had a player who had visual reading and interpretation problems. And I agreed to send them pretty much all the game materials in advance, like the big dashboard on the front, all the components that they might encounter, so that they could read them on their own time. They could zoom in on stuff if it was too small. I had a person, he signed up with a team. His team leader said, this guy has something where he might get exhausted halfway through the day and not be able to continue. And I let them bring in a fifth player, didn't make them pay for it or anything, and just said, if he gets exhausted, just, the players swap around. In the end, I don't think they used it anyway, and the fifth guy just sort of spectated and had a laugh. So obviously these are very specific examples. They're not super helpful, but the general idea I'm trying to present is I try to be as easy to talk to, and always present like a very calm, relaxed environment where, like, if you have an issue where you're worried that it might impact your enjoyment of the game, I ask you to let me know about it. And then, if we can make small modifications, or if there's just something I can let you know about or help you with in advance that'll make the game easier, then I really love doing that, just to try and make it as accessible as possible, because the mega games aren't super accessible depending on your problem. It's a game which tends to have a lot of physical movement and walking around. It's very intensely social in a way that some people can struggle with. So when we can make it more accessible, I like to try and do so as best as I can.
Brilliant. Cool. So that is all the time we have. So I would just like to ask a favor of my panelists here, which is we did have a question that I really wanted to have time to, which was, if you had a single piece of advice to give to someone who's looking to set up a new group, what would it be? I wonder whether after the talk you'd be up for going to the pub in the Discord server and just typing out what that advice would be. And Dave, I know we didn't get a chance to share your screen, so if you have any screenshots of that you'd like to share in the pub, then I think people would find that really interesting to see. But yeah, unfortunately, that is all the time that we've got. I think we could talk much longer about this topic, but we do need to make way for Jim's talk about facilitating mega games, which will be taking place in 15 minutes time. So I would just like to give a big thank you to Dave, John and Nellie for joining me today. Thank you so much for sharing all of your thoughts and ideas.
Thanks, Becky.
And a huge thank you to everyone who joined us to watch us today. So thanks very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of MegaCon.